Did the unthinkable, and Karen's reaction is priceless when I block her kids from trespassing. Mark Thompson had lived next door to Karen Peterson for 7 years, and their relationship had always been tense. A retired accountant with a meticulously maintained property, Mark took pride in his backyard. The in-ground swimming pool had been there for decades, a relic from the previous homeowner. Karen, a self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, had constantly complained about everything from the pool's maintenance to the occasional splash that might drift over the fence. The origins of their conflict traced back to Mark's first summer in the neighborhood. Fresh into retirement, he had looked forward to peaceful days tending to his garden and enjoying the quiet suburban street. Karen, however, had other plans. Her first interaction with Mark occurred just 2 weeks after he moved in, when she marched across the property line, clipboard in hand, to critique the shade of green he was painting his mailbox. "It's too bright," she had declared, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "It doesn't conform to the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines." Mark had tried to be diplomatic. "I'm sorry, but I checked with the homeowners association. This color is entirely within regulation." But diplomacy meant nothing to Karen. She was a woman who had made it her life's mission to maintain what she considered the perfect neighborhood order. A widow in her late 60s, she had lived in the same house for over 4 decades, and she believed this gave her an unquestionable authority over every square inch of the surrounding properties. The swimming pool became her primary source of contention. Despite the pool being well-maintained and completely within Mark's property lines, Karen found endless reasons to complain. She would call the city about supposed noise violations when Mark's grandchildren visited during summer. She filed multiple reports about excessive water waste and claimed the pool was a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Mark had tried various approaches. He'd hired professional pool maintenance services, ensured the water was always crystal clear, and even invited Karen to inspect the pool himself. Nothing seemed to satisfy her. Local neighbors had long since learned to tune out her constant complaints, but Mark found himself increasingly frustrated. The irony was not lost on him that he had moved to this neighborhood seeking tranquility after a demanding career in accounting. Instead, he found himself locked in a perpetual battle with a woman who seemed to derive her entire sense of purpose from finding fault with others. His adult children found this situation amusing. "Dad," his daughter would say during their weekly calls, "you could win an Olympic gold medal." And Karen would complain about the shine on your medal. Mark would chuckle, but the humor did little to soften the constant low-grade tension that permeated his daily life. The pool itself was a beautiful, if aging, feature. Installed in the late 1970s, it was a classic kidney-shaped design with original blue tiles that had somehow maintained their color over the decades. Mark had carefully maintained it, replacing the pump, resealing the edges, and keeping the surrounding area immaculate. To him, the pool represented more than just a water feature. It was a symbol of his commitment to preserving and respecting the property he had worked his entire life to own. Little did he know that this pool, a seemingly innocuous backyard feature, would become the catalyst for the most bizarre confrontation of his retirement years. After years of Karen's relentless complaints, Mark decided he had enough. The pool was aging, maintenance costs were rising, and the constant criticism had worn down his patience. He hired a professional team to remove the pool completely, transforming his backyard into a beautiful Zen garden with carefully placed rocks, native plants, and a small meditation area. Little did he know, this renovation would trigger Karen's most spectacular meltdown yet. The decision hadn't come easily. Mark's pool held memories, summers with his late wife Margaret, weekend visits from his grandchildren, quiet mornings of solitary reflection. But at 68, the maintenance had become increasingly challenging. The pool pump required constant attention, the liner was showing signs of wear, and the local regulations for pool safety had become increasingly complex and expensive to maintain. What truly pushed Mark over the edge was a series of incidents that culminated in his breaking point. It started with Karen's most recent complaint to the city, a meticulously documented report claiming that his pool was a public health hazard and a potential environmental disaster. The city inspector had dutifully visited, spending 3 hours examining every inch of the pool, testing the water, and checking the surrounding area. Not only did they find nothing wrong, but the inspector had also privately apologized to Mark for the unnecessary intrusion. "I'm sorry, sir," the young inspector had said, visibly embarrassed. "We have to follow up on all complaints, but this is clearly a case of harassment." That same week, Mark's grandson Tommy had shared his plans to become a landscape architect. During a family dinner, Tommy had sketched out a vision for a Zen-inspired garden, minimalist, low-maintenance, and environmentally friendly. The timing felt like a sign. The final straw came during a neighborhood association meeting. Karen had hijacked the agenda to once again discuss Mark's pool, presenting a 6-page document detailing supposed infractions. Most neighbors had stopped listening years ago, but Mark felt the weight of her constant scrutiny. When he looked around the room, he saw a mixture of embarrassment and pity in his neighbor's eyes. "I'm done," Mark told his daughter Sarah during their weekly phone call. I'm taking back my peace of mind. The pool removal was meticulously planned. Mark researched extensively, consulting landscape designers, environmental experts, and pool removal specialists. He obtained all necessary permits, ensuring every step would be completely above board. He knew Karen would be looking for any possible violation, so he was determined to be impeccable in his approach. The removal process was complex. It wasn't simply a matter of draining the pool and filling it with dirt. The team would need to properly break up the concrete, remove all pool equipment, ensure proper drainage, and prepare the site for landscaping. Mark chose a team known for their environmental sensitivity. They would recycle as much material as possible and ensure minimal disruption to the surrounding ecosystem. He deliberately scheduled the work for a week when his grandchildren wouldn't be visiting. The pool had been their summer playground, and he wanted to spare them the potentially emotional moment of watching it being dismantled. To Mark, this was more than just removing a pool. It was a transformation, a reclaiming of his personal space. What Mark didn't realize was how deeply this would affect Karen. To her, the pool wasn't just a water feature, it was a potential point of control, a source of endless complaints, and a weapon in her ongoing crusade of neighborhood micromanagement. Its removal would represent something far more significant than a simple backyard renovation. Little did Mark know that Karen was already formulating a plan that would involve an emergency call, wild accusations, and a series of events that would become neighborhood legend. On the day of the pool's removal, Karen became increasingly agitated. She paced her property line, taking photographs and muttering to herself. Mark overheard her making multiple phone calls, her voice rising with each conversation. When the pool was finally gone, replaced by the serene garden, Karen's behavior became even more erratic. She seemed convinced that Mark had done something nefarious with the pool's absence. The excavation had been a precise operation. Professional landscapers carefully removed the concrete, ensuring minimal disruption to the surrounding ecosystem. Native plants were brought in. Ornamental grasses, small Japanese maples, and carefully placed river rocks created a tranquil meditation space that was a far cry from the aging swimming pool. Karen's obsession began to take on a more complex dimension. Her daily routine, which had previously involved monitoring Mark's pool maintenance, now seemed completely disrupted. Neighbors noticed her behavior changing subtly. Where she once walked her small terrier with military precision, stopping to inspect every inch of the neighborhood, she now moved with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. Margaret, the retired librarian who lived 2 doors down, first noticed something peculiar. It was like she was searching for something. Margaret would later tell the local newspaper. Not just looking, but actively hunting for some kind of evidence. The evidence of what? Nobody knew. Mark's daughter, Sarah, noticed it during her next visit. "Dad," she said one evening, "the neighbor seems different. More intense than usual." Mark had laughed it off, explaining Karen's long-standing pattern of neighborhood surveillance. But even he couldn't ignore the increasingly strange occurrences. Karen began to make frequent trips to the local county records office. She filed multiple information requests, digging into the property history, pool permits, and any documentation she could find related to Mark's property. The clerks, who had dealt with her numerous complaints over the years, began to roll their eyes when she approached the counter. Her phone calls became more frequent and more cryptic. Mark's grandson, Tommy, visiting for the weekend, overheard fragments of a conversation when Karen was in her backyard. "They don't know what's underneath," she muttered into her phone. "Someone has to investigate." The local gossip mill began to churn. Neighbor of its speculation ran wild. Was Karen convinced Mark was hiding something? Had the pool removal triggered some deep-seated suspicion? Her behavior suggested she believed there was more to the story, something significant hidden beneath the newly laid Zen garden. Mark tried to ignore it. He focused on his new garden, enjoying the peace that came with the transformed space. The meditation area became his sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection away from Karen's increasingly manic energy. His grandchildren loved the new space, running between the carefully placed rocks and exploring the new landscape. But Karen's intensity continued to build. She began taking photographs at all hours, early morning, late night, sometimes standing at her fence line with a camera that looked more professional than a typical neighborhood surveillance setup. The local homeowners association received multiple complaints from Karen, each more elaborate than the last. What Mark didn't know was that Karen's obsession ran deeper than anyone could imagine. Her multiple phone calls, her frequent trips to the county records office, her careful documentation, all of it was leading to something. Something that would culminate in a 911 call so bizarre, so unexpected, that it would become the stuff of neighborhood legend. Little did Mark realize that the pool's removal had set in motion a chain of events that would transform a simple backyard renovation into the most spectacular neighborhood drama in recent history. Late one evening, Karen marched into her house and dramatically dialed 911. Her call was a masterpiece of fabrication. She claimed that Mark had illegally disposed of a massive environmental hazard and that he was hiding something dangerous in his backyard. The 911 dispatcher, initially patient, began to grow suspicious of her increasingly wild claims. Little did Karen know her call was being recorded. The evening had started ordinarily enough. Karen had spent hours compiling what she believed was irrefutable evidence of Mark's supposed misdeeds. Her dining room table was covered with a sprawling collection of documents, printed satellite images, hand-drawn diagrams, photocopied permits, and a series of notes that connected her elaborate theory. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Ever since Mark removed the pool, Karen had become convinced that something sinister was happening. Her corkboard, hidden in a spare bedroom, was a web of conspiracy, with red strings connecting various photographs and documents. To an outside observer, it would have looked like the work of an unhinged mind, but to Karen, it was a carefully constructed investigation. The 911 dispatcher, a young woman named Emily Rodriguez, initially maintained her professional composure. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "can you explain exactly what environmental hazard you're reporting?" Karen's voice trembled with a mixture of excitement and righteous indignation. "There's been illegal disposal, toxic waste. I've been monitoring the situation for weeks. My neighbor has removed his swimming pool, and I'm certain he's burying something dangerous beneath my entire neighborhood." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her training kicking in. She needed to gather information without escalating the situation. "Can you describe the specific nature of the hazard you're concerned about?" What followed was a remarkable stream of consciousness that defied logical explanation. Karen spoke of mysterious nighttime excavations, suspicious vehicle movements, and what she claimed were unnatural soil discolorations. She referenced geological surveys, water table reports, and fragments of conversations she claimed to have overheard. "He's destroyed evidence," Karen nearly shouted into the phone. "The pool was covering something up. I've seen the soil samples. There are trace elements that don't belong in a residential area." Emily could hear the desperation in Karen's voice. She had dealt with countless unusual calls during her years as a dispatcher, but this was something special. The woman wasn't just reporting a potential crime, she was constructing an entire narrative of suburban intrigue. In the background, Emily could hear papers shuffling. Karen was clearly referencing some kind of documentation, her voice becoming more frantic with each passing moment. She spoke of underground networks and potential environmental catastrophes with the passion of a conspiracy theorist. "I demand an immediate investigation," Karen declared. "The entire neighborhood could be at risk." Emily knew protocol. Despite the seemingly ridiculous nature of the call, she was required to take every report seriously. She began to ask specific questions, hoping to either substantiate or quickly dismiss Karen's claims. "Ma'am, can you provide specific evidence of this environmental hazard?" Karen's response was a masterpiece of circular logic and wild speculation. She spoke of satellite imagery, soil composition, and what she claimed were unauthorized geological alterations to Mark's property. To her, the removal of the pool was nothing short of a massive cover-up operation. Little did Karen know that her call was being recorded, recording that would soon become the talk of the entire neighborhood. What she believed was a crucial moment of public service was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. The dispatcher's patience was being tested to its absolute limit. Karen's story was becoming more elaborate with each passing minute, a complex tapestry of suspicion and wild imagination that seemed to have no basis in reality. Mark Thompson, completely unaware of the drama unfolding, was enjoying a quiet evening in his newly renovated backyard, the Zen garden illuminated by soft landscape lighting. He had no idea that his neighbor was about to set in motion a series of events that would become legendary. Two local police officers arrived at Mark's property, expecting to find evidence of some serious environmental crime. Instead, they found a perfectly landscaped backyard and a confused homeowner. Mark calmly explained the pool's removal, showing permits, contractor receipts, and before and after photographs. The officers struggled to maintain professional composure as the absurdity of Karen's claims became apparent. Officers Derek Rodriguez and Sarah Chen had been partners for 3 years, and they'd seen their fair share of unusual calls. But Karen's report was something special, even by suburban drama standards. As they pulled up to Mark's meticulously maintained property, they exchanged a knowing glance that spoke volumes. "Environmental hazard investigation," Derek muttered, checking his clipboard. "This ought to be good." Mark was in his garden when they arrived, wearing a pair of well-worn gardening gloves and pruning some newly planted ornamental grasses. He looked up, surprised but calm, as the two officers approached with their official demeanor. "Mr. Thompson?" Officer Chen asked, her professional tone carefully measured. Mark nodded, removing his gardening gloves. "Can I help you, officers?" The preliminary questioning began with a level of formality that seemed almost comical given the circumstances. Officer Rodriguez pulled out his standard investigation form, his pen poised to document what he was sure would be a quick and unremarkable encounter. "We've received a report of potential environmental hazards related to the removal of a swimming pool on your property," he explained, trying to keep a straight face. Mark invited them into his backyard, completely at ease. He had nothing to hide and found the entire situation somewhat amusing. The Zen garden was a testament to careful planning. Each rock placed with intention, native plants arranged to create a sense of natural harmony. It was about as far from an environmental hazard as one could imagine. As Mark walked them through the renovation process, he pulled out a comprehensive folder. Inside were detailed permits from the city, contractors' environmental impact assessment, soil testing reports, recycling certificates for the pool materials, landscape design plans, photographs documenting the entire removal process. Officer Chen examined the documents, her professional demeanor slowly giving way to barely contained amusement. The paperwork was impeccable, not just legal but extraordinarily thorough. The contractors even used an environmentally sensitive removal process, Mark explained. They recycled 92% of the pool materials and brought in native plants to restore the ecosystem. Derek Rodriguez struggled to maintain his professional composure. The massive environmental hazard Karen had reported was, in fact, a model of responsible property renovation. Each document was a nail in the coffin of her wild claims. Officer Chen noticed a framed photograph on an outdoor table, marked with his late wife, surrounded by grandchildren near the old pool. It humanized the investigation, transforming Mark from a potential suspect to simply a retired man who had made a thoughtful decision about his property. "Ma'am," Derek finally said into his radio, speaking to the dispatcher, "we're going to need to file this under unfounded complaint." Mark offered the officers iced tea, which they politely declined. The absurdity of the situation hung in the air. A perfectly maintained property, impeccable documentation, and a completely baseless complaint. As they prepared to leave, Officer Chen couldn't resist a final comment. "Mr. Thompson, this might be the most thoroughly documented pool removal in the history of our department." Mark chuckled. "Well, I knew Karen would be watching." Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The police investigation was merely the first act in a neighborhood drama that was about to become legendary. Karen's 911 call was about to take on a life of its own, transforming from a moment of perceived triumph into the most embarrassing episode of her life. The police not only found no evidence of wrongdoing, but also discovered that Karen had made multiple frivolous 911 calls in the past year. The dispatcher reviewed the call's recording, which captured Karen's increasingly desperate and ridiculous accusations. What was meant to be a moment of triumph for Karen turned into a humiliating public spectacle that would become neighborhood legend. The local police department had a standard protocol for handling repeated false reports, and Karen was about to become intimately familiar with it. Officer Rodriguez, meticulous in his documentation, began compiling a comprehensive report that would change everything for the neighborhood's most notorious busybody. It started with a formal review of Karen's call history. The dispatcher's office pulled records dating back 18 months, revealing a pattern that was both alarming and somewhat comical. There were calls about a teenager's skateboard allegedly damaging public property. It hadn't. Suspicions of illegal gardening practices on Maple Street. A suspicious package delivery that turned out to be a birthday gift. An unauthorized tree trimming that was completely legal. Multiple complaints about neighborhood noise levels that were well within municipal guidelines. Each call had been carefully logged, each investigation had found no merit. But Karen's 911 call about Mark's pool removal was the piece de resistance, a masterpiece of paranoid imagination that would become her ultimate downfall. The local police chief, Robert Martinez, was not amused. He was a man who took emergency services seriously, and frivolous calls meant potential resources being diverted from real emergencies. When the full report crossed his desk, he decided it was time for more than just a warning. Margaret Wilson, the retired librarian who lived 2 doors down from Karen, became an unexpected source of additional information. She had kept a meticulously detailed neighborhood journal, a habit from her years of professional documentation, and her notes provided a fascinating chronicle of Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. "She's been like this for years," Margaret told the investigating officers. "Always watching, always complaining. But this is a new level of absurdity." The local news caught wind of the story. What began as a simple neighborhood dispute quickly became a human interest piece that captured the imagination of the entire community. Local reporters descended on the quiet suburban street, interviewing neighbors, collecting statements, and piecing together the saga of Mark's pool and Karen's wild accusations. Social media only amplified the situation. Neighborhood group chats and local community forums erupted with memes, jokes, and increasingly elaborate retellings of the story. Mark became an unlikely hero, the calm, patient homeowner who had weathered years of harassment with grace and dignity. The Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting. While they typically tried to avoid public confrontations, Karen's repeated complaints and this latest incident had become impossible to ignore. Board members who had tolerated her behavior for years were now ready to take action. Karen's reputation, carefully cultivated over decades of self-appointed neighborhood surveillance, began to crumble. Neighbors who had previously avoided confrontation now felt emboldened to share their own stories of her relentless nitpicking and false complaints. The local municipal court became involved. False reporting was a serious offense, and Karen was looking at potential fines and mandatory community service. Her carefully constructed world of perceived authority was rapidly falling apart. Mark, for his part, remained remarkably composed. When asked about the situation by reporters, he simply smiled and said, "I just wanted to enjoy my retirement and my garden." Little did anyone know this was just the beginning of a neighborhood saga that would be talked about for years to come. Karen's 911 call had set in motion a chain of events that would transform their quiet suburban store.